Protesters defy COVID restrictions banning protests to gather in their thousands in central Tunis. Their angry President Kais Saied has dissolved Tunisia's judicial watchdog, the Supreme Judicial Council, and his latest law gives him near total control over the appointment and dismissal of judges. Critics say he's now consolidated power over all the country's institutions.
The president has relieved some judges of their posts, dismissed others and prevented them from objecting or striking. The judiciary that we resort to is now under the control of the president.
G7 states and the UN have voiced deep concerns about Saied's actions and his increasingly authoritarian rule. The EU says its member states are discussing cutting funding to Tunisia. And Tunisia's judges have been on strike demanding independence for the judiciary and the reinstatement of the watchdog. Kais Saied's supporters and many lawyers, however, support his decision and accuse the council of failing to root out corruption that they say is rife among judges. These demonstrators say they're afraid that Kais Saied is dismantling the state.
There are no longer any independent constitutional institutions today. Yesterday was the last of them before he decided to establish a temporary body for the Supreme Judicial Council.
But a movement calling themselves Citizens Against the Coup say they're not giving up.
The political and democratic movement of the street continues, and with the same objectives and the same approach.
Critics say that Kais Saied is gambling on gaining total control over Tunisia at the risk of losing the financial support of the G7 and EU. But this protest shows that many Tunisians are prepared to defy his authority and fight against dictatorship that they fought so hard to overturn 11 years ago.
They say it will be a street-by-street cleanup strategy, police fighting a crime wave in Lima, a city of nearly 10 million people. On Friday night, they closed several blocks of a street lined with bars in one of the city's most dangerous districts as part of the state of emergency.
The neighborhood councils call us and tell us who are incurring in offenses. We are working with that information.
Dozens of armed robberies recorded by security cameras in recent months have many Peruvians, particularly women, living in fear. Margarita Moya says she's been forced to adapt.
I don't go out on the street after 5 p.m. I've been assaulted many times. They take your wallet and phone, and now if I have to go out, I don't have anything in my purse.
The most common attacks, young men targeting backpacks and purses, or men on motorcycles stealing cell phones from their victims. Peru's telecommunications regulator says an average of 4,000 cell phones are stolen every day around the country. The National Institute of Statistics says more than a quarter of Lima's population have been crime victims. More than 80% of the people who live in the state of emergency zone say they are dissatisfied with police security. But for the police, it is difficult. For instance, in this area where more than 800,000 people live, there's only 10 police cars to patrol the streets. Now the government has ordered the army to join the patrols, and with a clenched fist, says Defense Minister José Luis Gavidia.
We'll use the full force of the law. Our soldiers know what they need to do. We're armed forces and we go out with guns. Authority is respected and that principle must be recovered.
Some analysts say the government lacks a considered plan to combat crime effectively.
Instead of deterring, the armed forces may encourage organized crime actors to arm themselves, like in Brazil or Mexico. Although we have an increasing level of violence, we are not in a critical situation. My impression is that the government's measure is basically populist.
The coronavirus pandemic has left more than 4 million Peruvians without a job, and police say most people involved in criminal activity are young, unemployed men. 60% of Peruvians disapprove of President Pedro Castillo's 6-month-long government for a range of reasons, including the crime rate. Critics say more police and soldiers on the streets, even if effective, will do little to curb public discontent.
The main bridge linking Canada to the US is open again. Police enforcing a court order ended the 6-day blockade by protesters demanding an end to COVID restrictions. They made several arrests and set up barricades to stop it happening again. The protest hit supply chains on both sides of the border. But outside Canada's Parliament in Ottawa, protesters are refusing to leave even as the local government eases COVID restrictions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has had enough, invoking special emergency measures to confront the protesters.
This is not a peaceful protest. At the borders in different parts of the country, the blockades are harming our economy and endangering public safety.
The 1988 Emergencies Act allows the federal government to ensure security during national emergencies. This has never been used. A similar move was last employed in 1970. The Prime Minister then, Trudeau's father, Pierre.
The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate.
The so-called Freedom Convoy protests began because Canadian truckers opposed a vaccine or quarantine mandate for cross-border drivers. But it soon became a rallying point for people opposing the Trudeau government. And now it's spawned copycat protests globally. In Belgium, demonstrators there were joined by others from France, Holland and Germany to demand a halt to COVID restrictions by Europe's governments.
The message is, leave us alone. We are peaceful. We will leave you alone. We are not accepting any jabs anymore.
And in Israel, a convoy of trucks drove the main highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, heading for the Parliament building.
We all support Canada and support the truckers' convoy that went up to Ottawa, and we do here the same.
Critics have accused the so-called Freedom Convoys of having little popular support, but authorities are aware of the disruption even small protests can cause, and like Canada, are now examining what actions are available to keep roads, bridges and supply lines open.
There is a safety concern.
Confrontations in Canada's capital as police are given new powers to charge truckers who have held firm for nearly 3 weeks.
Please give your respect.
Trucks and protesters have shut down these streets outside Parliament in downtown Ottawa, as well as disrupting businesses and cross-border trade with the US.
It's what enshrines our inalienable rights as citizens. So we have, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to move, freedom to do this.
Canadian truckers, calling themselves the Freedom Convoy, had gathered to make a stand against the rule that required truckers to be vaccinated to cross the US-Canadian border. They were later joined by other protesters, many from far-right groups. On Thursday, police moved in to arrest the leaders, Chris Barber, filmed here, and Tamara Litch. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has invoked the Emergencies Act, which gives powers to declare the blockade illegal, arrest drivers, freeze bank accounts and suspend licenses.
On Monday, as we entered the 3rd week of illegal blockades and occupations, the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act. We did it to protect families and small businesses, to protect jobs and the economy. We did it because the situation could not be dealt with under any other law in Canada.
Police have secured a perimeter around the protests in the downtown core. They've handed these orders to truckers: leave or face charges.
It's just a fake paper. So it says here you must leave the area now, and warning that anyone blocking streets or assisting others in the blocking of the streets are committing a criminal offense, and you might be arrested.
I'm not afraid to be arrested as much as time it's going to take to get everything straightened out and back to work normal. I mean, if they arrest me, then I go back to work eventually once it's all sorted out. But if they don't want to come to the table and talk, I stay here and I'm not working anyway, so we'll see where it goes.
The movement has captured the world's attention, but the Canadian Truckers Association says it doesn't represent the majority of drivers who are vaccinated and working hard to ensure trade continues. Police now want to end this peacefully, but even with threats, many truckers remain defiant.
Any other weekday, Paola Amoroso would be on shift making sure patrons don't damage priceless works of art at a museum in Rome. Instead, she's at a protest against Italy's latest COVID-19 restriction. To go to work, it's now required for all Italians over the age of 50 to get their COVID-19 vaccine. something 61-year-old Amoroso refuses to do.
They're stealing my job, part of my life. It's disoriented me. The bills haven't started arriving yet, but when they do, what then?
Italy's latest COVID-19 restriction took effect on Tuesday, meaning around 500,000 unvaccinated workers over 50 are barred from going to work or receiving sick pay. For months, Italy has increased restrictions on the unvaccinated. First, they were barred from restaurants and other venues. Now, their very livelihoods and income are at risk for refusing the jab.
I am not anti-vax, but I support the freedom to choose. Everyone should be able to decide for themselves whether to take the vaccine or not. If someone decides not to, they shouldn't go hungry, taking their job away.
Although Italy has a nearly 90% vaccination rate, the government says it's necessary to encourage as many people in higher risk age groups to get the jab.
Those opposed to the measure say this latest restriction is an abuse of state power, that it takes away a fundamental right from the individual, the choice of what to put in their body.
It's simply a threat. It's the same thing the mafia does. The mafia tells you if you don't obey, I'm going to make your life impossible. And the government says if you don't give me access to your body, we'll make your life impossible.
Medical experts like Dr. Patrizia Laurenti disagree.
The government has given us a tool for protection. In a pandemic, this is necessary. This isn't a normal time. These haven't been normal times for the past 2 years. This tough choice is necessary.
A tough choice to get their shots that hundreds of thousands of workers are still unwilling to make. The aftermath of a string of recent bombings and arson attacks in Foggia, a small city in southern Italy. No injuries were reported, but the message was clear. The local mafia was pushing back. Over the past 2 years, police have seized millions of dollars in assets and made several arrests. Some businesses are now refusing to pay protection money to the mafia. Alessandro Zito ran a construction firm here until his business was burned down by the mob. Facing death threats, he relocated his family. He now heads the newly launched local anti-racketing association.
By some estimates, 70% of businesses here pay protection to the mafia, a figure we can't confirm. With the association, we are trying to show people they are not alone. The only way to root out this problem is to stand up together.
In the wake of the bombings, police have increased patrols and investigations and set up roving checkpoints. Poor and underdeveloped like much of the South, Foggia has been the base for the so-called Fourth Mafia for decades. Unknown to many outside Italy, the collection of clans in the area make most of their money off extortion, drug trafficking, and prostitution.
The bombings weren't just directed at people not paying protection. The owner of this flower shop that was bombed wouldn't speak to us on camera, but she said no one ever came here asking her for money, and that's what scares her most. Investigators say these attacks were meant to spread fear.
Prosecutor Antonia Laronga showed us the mafia's reach here and how they control this area on the southeast coast of Italy.
The organization clearly feels the need for marketing. These attacks are meant to send a clear message. We are here.
Despite recent gains, Laronga isn't convinced they'll take the local mafia down soon.
I'm not optimistic. The path to justice is going to be a long one. There are some hopeful signs, but the situation is still uncertain. There are lots of powerful clans and a culture of crime here.
Luca Vigilante and his family run a chain of health clinics in the area, treating thousands of patients. The mafia came calling. Despite the risks, his family said no.
In the future, if my children follow in my footsteps in this work, after teaching them their whole life about morality, ethics, Christian values, I'd have to say, look, if you want to continue this work, you'll have to give money to criminals. It would be hypocritical and absurd, a really awful thing for them.
Not all here feel they can stand up to the mob. They know when the police aren't there to protect them, the mafia could come calling again.
Fist bump diplomacy as defense chiefs from NATO countries, including the US and Germany, arrive at alliance headquarters to strengthen their stance on Russia and pore over the latest intelligence. And this is what they've been looking at. A Russian Defense Ministry video claiming to show a partial pullback of forces from near Ukraine. The Kremlin says combat equipment and troops were leaving the Crimean Peninsula seized from Kiev in 2014 and returning to base. But NATO Secretary General was quick to dismiss any talk of a de-escalation of tensions.
We have heard the signs from Moscow about readiness to continue diplomatic efforts, but so far we have not seen any de-escalation on the ground. On the contrary, it appears that Russia continues the military build-up.
Strong words too from European Union chiefs in Strasbourg, urging Moscow to come to the negotiating table.
The choice today is between war and tragic sacrifices that would go along with it, or the courage of a political engagement, the courage of a diplomatic negotiation. Very clearly, the European Union chooses diplomacy and chooses negotiation. We will demonstrate this courage.
There was little sign of any Russian troop withdrawals in Belarus on Wednesday. This, another show of military muscle for the cameras. Joint exercises with Belarusian troops only deepening fears in neighbouring Ukraine that an invasion's imminent. On the land and in the air, NATO says Russia has reached full combat readiness. But there is a shred of hope. In recent days, Russia has signalled that it will be willing to join talks. That door remains open. Do too much and NATO runs the risk of being drawn into a long, protracted standoff with Russia. Do too little and it runs the risk of a possible invasion in Ukraine, something that could destabilise the whole of Europe. Russia is creating a new normal, said Stoltenberg, by using force to contest the principle of sovereignty in Europe. The alliance, he said, must respond possibly with a new NATO battle group in Romania. The hope of an easy end to this standoff is fast fading. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, Brussels.
Well, we have two correspondents covering developments this hour. In a moment, we'll go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, in Washington. But first to Natasha Butler, who's monitoring reaction from Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Natasha, as this NATO defense ministers was being held in Brussels today, Ukraine was holding a day of national unity, a so-called day of national unity, and the president has been speaking about it. Tell us more.
Yes, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, saying that Ukrainians are strong, that they are ready to defend themselves, that they are ready to fight. Fight, he says, whether it's February the 16th, 17th, 18th, April or September. Now, Zelensky was talking from the port city of Mariupol in the southeast of the country, very close to the front line where Ukrainian forces have been fighting Russian-backed separatists now for nearly 8 years. So it was a highly symbolic choice of location. And this is the day that Zelensky has called a day of unity in Ukraine. He called for this a couple of days ago. The idea is to try and rally some patriotism, to try and send a message to Moscow that Ukrainians are united, that they would fight if they were attacked. And he chose this date of February 16th, the significant date. It's not a date chosen by chance, but it's the day that some Western intelligence sources said that Russia could begin an invasion.
And so what has Ukraine been saying as far as Russia's claims that it's been withdrawing some of its troops, including from Crimea? What's their assessment of Russian troop movements?
Well, Zelensky also touched on that earlier in the day. He said, look, show us the proof, show us the evidence. He says he has not seen any evidence at all that Russia is drawing down any of its troops on Ukraine's border. And we know that is the same sentiment that we have heard from other Western allies, that they simply haven't seen the evidence. The foreign minister here in Ukraine has said, look, this seems very much along the lines of what we've seen before from Russia, that they say one thing, but they actually do another. However, the foreign minister did say that if there was to be any form of drawdown, then that would be certainly welcomed as a sign of de-escalation from Moscow. It would be seen as a sign that the diplomacy is perhaps working. In the meantime, I should say as well, the Ukrainian government has also commented on these huge cyber attacks that took place on Tuesday night here. Cyber attacks that the government said targeted two major state banks, the websites of the Defence Force and the Army. Huge attacks, they said, on a scale they'd not seen before, even though they didn't damage any infrastructure, just the web pages. Ukraine's president, again, Zelensky, said when it comes to those cyber attacks that the government here believes that foreign forces are behind those attacks. He is not pointing the finger at anyone in particular or naming them. But again, Western intelligence has said in the past that Russia could use cyber warfare against Ukraine.
Natasha, thank you for the update. Natasha Butler is our correspondent in Kiev there. Let's now go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, in Washington, D.C. Kimberly, where do things stand as far as the White House is concerned?
Well, fresh warnings of potential cyber warfare in the United States as well from the FBI, the National Security Agency, warning particularly defense contractors to be wary of potential attacks, particularly when it comes to not only military plans, internal communications, and even the intentions in terms of strategy and so on. This is something that has been put out as an alert in the last couple of hours. And in terms of those claims by Russia of a drawdown, the U.S. Secretary of State saying that the intelligence that has been seen by the United States indicates just the opposite. In fact, they report that they are seeing more bolstering of Russian forces along the border with Ukraine, not less. So to that end, given the fact that there is this belief that there is still a window of a potential for an imminent invasion, the U.S. President Joe Biden will be holding a consultation telephone call as they continue to coordinate closely with allies. That phone call will be with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and that will be taking place at 19:30 GMT. Why is this important? Because the German Chancellor was meeting in Moscow just 24 hours ago with Vladimir Putin. So in the effort to try and continue to try and de-escalate, something the U.S. President says is a primary goal, he is working with his allies at the same time preparing for any eventuality, including a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Anna Dunda is making pasta. That and porridge make up her diet, which she shares with her mother, for whom she cares. Together they earn $1,000 a month in pensions. They own their small apartment, so there's no rent to pay. But as energy costs rise, many of Dunda's neighbors have received electricity bills they cannot pay. And when hers comes, she says she'll take to the streets.
I won't pay it because I can't. Who can be all right with 500 or even 1,000 euros? Who can eat and pay the utilities? No one. This is life or death.
Rising energy costs are reflected in food costs. The government is subsidizing farmers' fuel even more than usual and has halved sales tax on animal feed and fertilizer. But it's not enough, says Dora Papa, who runs a pie shop in central Athens. The fresh meat and vegetables that go into her pies have gone up 40% since last summer. Since Christmas, her electricity bill doubled.
I didn't raise the price of my pies. I added 50 cents to the price of other foods. It doesn't cover my increased costs. But if I put prices up further, I'll lose customers because many of them are pensioners. I'm going to wait. If I can't make ends meet, I'm going to reduce the kitchen staff and work longer hours.
Energy costs rose by more than 15% last year across developed economies, the highest annual rise in 40 years. And that's what's driving most inflation. Here in Greece, electricity prices alone tripled last year, and the government is spending more than $2 billion subsidizing energy costs for households, businesses and farmers. Greece has been one of the most exposed European economies to energy price shocks because 40% of its electricity is generated from imported natural gas. The energy subsidies are moving Greece away from its goal of sustainability, says one environmental think tank.
This is really a fossil fuel subsidy. These are much needed funds that could have been used for energy efficiency projects, renewable energy projects, energy storage projects, as well as support of just transition in the lignite regions of Greece.
Greek incomes were battered by an 8-year depression following the 2008 global financial crisis, and they still haven't recovered. In politics, that vulnerability is a greater concern than the long-term goal of sustainability.
It's a culinary hotspot in the central market of Buenos Aires. And people here pride themselves in cooking the best Spanish tortillas in the city. But with the country's inflation rate at 50%, Patricia Rodriguez Real says she has to make an extra effort each month to keep the business going.
Argentina is a disorganized country, but we learn to surf the situation. It's a constant challenge and a learning experience. Our products have very good quality. I don't want to reduce our quality, so what I do is try to sell as much as I can so I gain in quantity and don't have to increase the price as much.
The government has been trying to regulate the rise in prices with controls and other economic measures, but it has not succeeded.
Inflation has been a problem for Argentines for decades, and that's why people implement strategies to protect their income. In this market, for example, butchers meet once a month to agree on the price of certain cuts, and they promote those prices in cardboards like this one. The problem, we're told, is that this month the price of beef went up around 7%, so now they have to change these cardboards once again.
José Luis Aduna owns a butcher shop. Since the pandemic, beef consumption has dropped significantly, and he's still trying to recover from the economic impact.
The beef culture in Argentina is huge, with barbecues every weekend. What we see is people not eating as much beef like before, and they are eating pork and chicken instead.
Inflation forces the government to guarantee that salaries and pensions increase to keep up with the constant rise in prices. Protests like this one show it does not always work. On Tuesday, thousands gathered in the center of Buenos Aires to demand more government assistance. Argentina and the International Monetary Fund are in financial talks to negotiate more than 40 billion in debts to target inflation. But economists say the fight to control rising prices won't be easy.
In Argentina, there are several factors that have an impact on inflation. That's why it's so difficult to tackle it. Unless there is an integral plan that attacks all those causes of inflation, it's like a monster with 1,000 heads. Argentines have gotten used to living with inflation, and many have found ways to survive it. But it's a vicious cycle that has hurt the country's chances of growth.
Argentines have gotten used to living with inflation, and many have found ways to survive it. But it's a vicious cycle that has hurt the country's chances of achieving long-lasting economic growth.
These fishermen should be on the shore casting their lines for their daily catch. But last month's oil spill disaster has left more than 2,000 artisanal fishermen without a livelihood.
Our lifeline is being cut and we don't know what to do.
They've turned to communal kitchens for survival. Oil giant Repsol gave them $130 in vouchers, but Walter de la Cruz says it's not enough.
It seems this month I will not be able to pay my bank debt, the electricity, water, everything in the house. We ask Repsol to help us.
More than 12,000 barrels of crude spilled, impacting flora and fauna along 80 kilometers of the coast of Lima. Experts say it's the worst ecological disaster in Peru.
We are in a position to confirm that theoretically we have collected almost 98% of the oil, both from the sea and from land.
Repsol has filed a lawsuit blaming the oil tanker. The company says these pipes that tore off the main underwater pipeline were in optimal condition. An extraordinary force, meaning the ship moved, ripped them, causing the fuel leakage. An expert in maritime accidents says the spill should have been minimal if valves that immediately block the fuel passage when an accident like this happens had been in place, but they were not.
If the terminal had those valves that separate and seal the tubes, maybe a liter would have spilled during the closing procedure. To me, that's a real cause, because breakage on these types of terminals is a common incident.
Peru's Environmental Assessment and Control Agency could fine Repsol with $80 million.
Repsol says they will soon be done with the cleanup, but many fishermen say the damage done will last for years and they don't know how they will be making a living from now on.
Shellfish divers recorded underwater showing, despite what Repsol says, the water is polluted.
The damage to the natural bank will be irreparable for a long time. To clean it is one thing, but to decontaminate is another story.
For now, these fishermen can only watch and wait and wonder what will be the long-term effects of the worst ecological disaster on this coast.
It was billed as perhaps the UK's worst storm in 30 years, with winds expected of 140 kilometres an hour. But that's a mere breeze compared to what Storm Eunice actually delivered. A gust on the Isle of Wight topped 196 kilometres an hour and has provisionally become the UK's strongest recorded wind. For all Eunice's fury, though, the damage could have been a whole lot worse.
If, as I say, the surge had coincided with the winds and the high tide, we could have seen some devastation, hence the severe flood warnings and some evacuations. So I'm really happy that those things have got out of sync, but it was great that everyone was prepared and the public listened and people kept themselves safe.
Eunice has killed and injured people, though. Fatalities from falling trees have been confirmed in the UK, Ireland and the Netherlands. But in most places the damage has been to property rather than lives.
Now this rather sorry sight here is London's O2 Arena, formerly known as the Millennium Dome. It's a huge, great concert and exhibition space in London South East, featured in James Bond films and the like. But as you can see, Storm Eunice has shredded a huge, great hole in its fabric skin, really ripped it apart. It's going to be some effort to fix that one, I think.
And then there was the disruption. Travellers anxiously watched information boards as train after train was cancelled. There was gridlock on many roads. This tailback was caused by the closure of the Dartford Bridge, part of London's M25 orbital motorway. 400 plus flights were grounded too. Now, every disaster needs a hero, and cometh the hour, cometh Big Jet TV. The aviation enthusiasts' live web stream isn't used to large audiences, but more than 200,000 logged on as host Jerry Dyer's live commentary went viral, cheering on planes as they struggle to land at Heathrow.
Easy, easy, easy. Go on, son. Oh, okay, tippy toe. Is it too cold? Yeah! Big swing, man!
Eunice has moved fast, sweeping across the UK and Ireland in less than a day. Now the rest of Northern Europe is taking its turn.